Hello again. I'm Martyn Heyne of Lichte Studio in Berlin, and today I'd like to address the subject of sampling rates, also known as sample rates, and digital audio in general. Unless you're already deeply familiar with the subject, you're likely to be surprised by what I'm about to tell you, as there are some quite common and very widespread misconceptions with this subject. One curious aspect with this topic is that I often encounter people who are extremely knowledgeable and experienced when it comes to electronics, analog audio, recording techniques and so forth, and yet they share the same misconceptions when it comes to sampling rates in digital audio. My guess as to why that is the case is that sampling rates simply don't matter enough for people to run into any kinds of real-world problems. Not understanding the finer ins and outs of sampling rates is really mostly harmless. Therefore, the tip that I've given to the self-recording musicians who are forever asking me about this subject is this: the less you worry about it, the better. As long as you're recording at 44.1, 48, 88.2 or 96 kilohertz, you're gonna be just fine. But I know that barely anyone ever takes this advice, so let's get into it. First of all, what is sampling rate? It's how many samples are taken of an audio signal per second, so commonly 44,100 to 96,000. What is a sample? It's two pieces of information. First, the value of the signal on the y-axis, and secondly, its point in time on the x-axis. Additionally, it's important to keep in mind that what we're trying to capture are sine waves. If at this point you're thinking, okay, that's all very well, but what about all the other crazy shapes? Then please go back and watch the video about the audio signal and then come back here. Okay, so now let's say this is our sine wave. It looks like this. Now, we've taken a certain amount of samples of it at each of the positions of the dots that you can see here. Then a DAW or DAW might represent this waveform, if you zoom in closely enough, as this stair-step pattern here. You've all seen this, right? Okay, now let's look at the same waveform with double the sampling rate. And you might say, this does look a little healthier than the lower sampling rate. It's now more closely approximating the shape of the actual waveform. And I believe it is this visual analogy that is tripping people up. They're afraid that the digital audio is jagged and incomplete, whereas analog is smooth and not missing any information. They believe that samples are like pixels in a digital image, and the greater the resolution, the more you can zoom in before beginning to see the nasty digital reality. This, however, is just not how digital audio works. Let's go back to our waveform. These stair steps are just a visual representation. If you were to look at this signal on an oscilloscope after the D to A conversion, it would be perfectly smooth again. As you may remember from the video about the audio signal, it wouldn't even physically be possible for a speaker to recreate a stair-step signal. Let's look at what the computer really knows about the signal. It's this: a set of discrete values in time. Some DAWs may visualize these with straight lines between the dots, which makes them look better but really makes no difference to the information at all. In any case, if this is the information we have, wouldn't the resolution still be better if we had more dots? Well, no. And that's because the computer doesn't simply play back the dots. Instead, it recreates the perfect waveform based on the information gathered from the dots. That means it knows that if the dots are in these positions, the rest of the waveform will have to be exactly where it really is, as there is no other possibility. So the waveform it recreates from the dots is really the exact full waveform, is not jagged or pixelated in any way. The funny thing is that the computer can reconstruct the waveform from the set of samples, but the waveform doesn't actually exist in the computer before the reconstruction. So the data only holds the potential for reconstruction and not the actual waveform. Now the surprising thing is that we need as little as 2 samples per cycle to perfectly, without any loss, reconstruct our waveform, as long as we can guarantee that there are no frequencies higher than half the sampling rate present in the signal. So our waveform could be reconstructed without any distortion from as little information as this: sample 1, sample 2, and this is where the third sample would fall just outside of this cycle. Again, you may say, okay, but wouldn't it still be better to have more? Imagine this was a 44.1 kHz session and you have 2 samples. Then at 96 kHz, you'd have 5. If there was anything to the visual analogy thought, then 5 would still be far too little. The difference in sampling rates, once you start thinking in analog terms like that, is really minimal. If this wouldn't work, it wouldn't work with 5 samples either. In fact, it wouldn't work at all. What really matters is that the samples that are being taken with the greatest possible accuracy. Alright, so you can recreate any audio signal as long as the sampling rate is just above twice the highest frequency of that signal. This is called the sampling theorem and has been formulated by Martyn Heyne already in 1928. After him, the highest possible frequency, depending on the sampling rate, is named the Nyquist frequency. For the lowest common sampling rate of 44.1 kHz, the Nyquist frequency would be 22.05 kHz. So that's already outside of the commonly assumed limit of human hearing. For 96 kHz, Nyquist would be at 48, so there you have the ability to record just over an octave of ultrasonic information as well. Let's also quickly take a look at what would happen if you did have frequencies above Nyquist in the signal. Here is our sine wave with the minimal sampling from earlier. And now I've gone and extremely clumsily added another tone, a higher one, on top of that. As you can see, the higher tone also passes through all the same sampling points as the lower one and would therefore be mistaken by the computer for the lower one. This is called aliasing, and to prevent it, we have to make sure that all frequencies above Nyquist are filtered out from the signal. Alright, so as we can see, all 4 of the common sampling rates can record and play back 20 Hz to 20 kHz with full accuracy and no loss whatsoever. Of course, that's not the end of the story, and there is a list of differences between the various sampling rates, but resolution within the audible range is not one of them. Let's dive a little deeper. As you can see from this example, the computer may be able to perfectly recreate this waveform from the samples, but it doesn't actually know the amplitude or volume of this signal because none of the sample points happen to fall at the maximum magnitude of the wave. These peaks that are not actually sampled are known as intersample peaks. In practice, this is only a minute issue, as most frequencies have a ton of superfluous samples that will give accurate information of the amplitude. Only in mastering, when signal levels get very close to 0 dBFS and the material tends to have a lot of high frequency content, does one have to take this sort of thing into account. Digital meters can also simply oversample a signal in order to display more accurate level information. Another aspect that I've briefly touched upon is that higher sampling rates such as 88.2 and 96 kHz allow for an extra octave of high frequencies to be recorded when compared to 44.1 and 48. And it is indeed the case that some instruments are capable of producing energy at such frequencies. And while they are commonly presumed to be outside the limits of human hearing, I'm not here to argue that they cannot have an effect on humans, even if it may be on a more unconscious level. However, most microphones, speakers, and a lot of the gear in between simply can't pass such ultrasonic frequencies. Again, I'd like to make the point that what we're trying to digitize is not the infinite depth of reality. That ended at the microphone, but rather a fairly simple electrical voltage signal. So am I saying all converters and sampling rates essentially sound the same? Absolutely not. What people tend to overlook in an ADDA is the A's. It's not just a digital unit, but it's got analog stages as well. And that means it needs good components, good circuitry, good cabling, great power supply, all of which is costly. Especially as the D2A, the converter is the machine that creates the actual signal. Of course, the level of quality with which it accomplishes that task is important. It's just not exactly a question of sampling rate. I'm also not saying there's never any point to higher sampling rates. My RME ADI 2 Pro FSR Black Edition, what have you, for example, supports sampling rates up to 768 kHz, which can be useful for measuring purposes or to check for ultrasonic dirt in your system, for example. And quite commonly, A to D converters will massively oversample the incoming signal in order to achieve a better signal-to-noise ratio. But again, that's a question of the converter's design and not really to do with the sampling rate that you set your DAW session to. Some manufacturers of high-end converters have argued that an issue with the higher sampling rates is that the higher speed results in lower accuracy. And while the extra bandwidth isn't necessary, accuracy is. Further arguments against higher sampling rates are computing power and file sizes, but these seem to matter less and less as computers have gotten stronger. Another argument for higher sampling rates would be the ability to slightly reduce a system's latency, and that can be a valuable consideration. Perhaps a more relevant factor with sampling rates is the filter that needs to be applied in order to remove all frequencies above Nyquist. At 44.1 kHz, there's precious little space for the filter to work, and it needs to be quite steep. Especially if the signal is being filtered over and over again in the mixing stage, it might make sense to relax the filter just a little and give it a bit more space at 48 kHz. Here we also touch on the fact that there's a difference between the tracking format, the final consumer format, and the sampling rate of a mixing session. While for the final consumer format there seems to me to be no advantage to higher sampling rates, they can have an effect on the mixing session. This is mostly relevant if you use non-linear processes in the digital domain, so that would be your saturation plugins or compressors or console emulation or tape modeling, anything that adds harmonics. You see, if you have your signal that is below Nyquist and you saturate it, that means you add harmonics to it. They are getting progressively higher. So these harmonics may now go well beyond the Nyquist frequency into the ultrasonic spectrum. What happens then is what I described earlier is aliasing. The digital system, unable to correctly identify these ultrasonic frequencies, will misinterpret them for the frequencies that it can understand. And these can and will show up back down in the audible spectrum as distortion. I've created an example here wherein I'm playing just a single sine wave at 5 kHz in a 44.1 kHz session. So this is the sine wave I'm creating with the generator. After this tone, I've added a serious amount of saturation, and you can see that there are not only additional tones above the original 5K, but all sorts of frequencies are popping up below as well. Now, this is the exact same setup in terms of the 5 kHz tone and the saturation, but now this session is running at 96 kHz. At this sampling rate, there is over an octave of additional space in the high frequencies, and the computer can still understand more of the ultrasonic frequencies generated by the saturation, so they don't show up as aliasing below. Notice, however, that the problem only gets better. It does not disappear completely. This is 44. This is 96. Granted, this is an extreme example, created only in order to demonstrate the difference. In a real-world scenario, the extra bandwidth of a 96 kHz session may well be enough to keep the remaining aliasing at such a low level that it's irrelevant. I'm also not saying that any of this is terribly important, just that there is a measurable and audible difference. Okay, so let's conclude that for some gentle saturation, working at 96 kHz may well be the way to go. However, if you wish to do some more serious damage, you're going to have to find some more thorough solutions as well. These might include oversampling within the saturation instance, and then band limiting or filtering of the newly created harmonic content before you downsample again, so the harmonics cannot wander off past Nyquist. That is certainly a possible way of doing it nowadays. But if you go down that route, again, it doesn't really matter very much anymore what sampling rate your mixing session was set to in the first place. Okay, let's look at another issue that comes up if our signal path is ever anything other than squeaky clean, also known as non-linear. As we said, if we have a single tone and add distortion, we get the added harmonics of that tone. Now, if we have two tones and mix them together in a nonlinear stage, then we also get the sums and differences of these tones. So frequency 1 plus frequency 2 and frequency 2 minus frequency 1. These distortions are called intermodulation products. Let's look at them in the computer. Here I have a sine wave at 300 Hz. Let's call it f1. And another at 500 Hz. Let's call it f2. While they are in the perfectly clean digital world, they remain happily separated. Now, if I add a nonlinear stage, we can see some new frequencies. For example, here at 800, this is f1 plus f2. 300 plus 500 is 800. And here at 200, we have f2 minus f1, 500 minus 300. But it doesn't stop there. The two original frequencies also have harmonics now. 2f1 at 600 here, 3f1 at 900 here. And these harmonics also produce sums and differences with the other tones. So for example, the second harmonic of f1 called 2f1 is at 600, and that plus f2, 500, is this tone at 1100 here. 2f1 minus f2, 600 minus 500, is this tone down here at 100. Okay, here my project sampling rate is set to 96 kHz and my analyzer is going all the way up to 40 kHz here. Now I'll add some noise up here. You can see this is filtered so that there is none in the audible band under 20 kHz. This is ultrasonic noise and only visible, not audible at all. So because we're at 96 kHz, this noise can exist, but it can't possibly hurt, right? It's just a little bit more bandwidth. Well, so far we're okay, but let's add an audible note. And because we're in the clean digital world, there's still no issue. But now let's add some saturation as well. Oh boy. Now the noise is intermodulating with the audible signal and spreading all the way down the spectrum. This could happen inside the mix when you use nonlinear stages, but it could even happen after the DAW in the analog playback system, which is most likely not perfectly linear either. Let's take one closer look at this by removing the noise and instead isolating a single ultrasonic frequency, this one. Now if I add my audible frequency back in, they play nice together again as long as everything's clean. If I add my distortion, now we can see that additional frequencies appear well below my original frequency. The intermodulation with the ultrasonic frequency causes noise, and if I move my audible frequency, you can see that the intermodulation products start to jump around as well. These here, look at them. Go up, go down, in the opposite direction of my actual signal. So in conclusion, I'm again not saying that this is what makes or breaks productions, but that clearly ultrasonic energy in a signal is not really contributing as it's not audible, but it can cause audible problems. Of course, the degree of the problem depends on the level of the ultrasonic noise as well as the following distortion. Alright, so higher sampling rates can help and they can hurt. However, none of the classic four are really in any way terrible. If you tend to use your computer as a tape machine only and do audio mixing on a console with analog outboard, then 48 kHz would be a great choice. Also, if you do classical music and mix in the box using just faders and EQ and delays and reverbs, then 48 kHz again would be great. And incidentally, that's what many classical recordists deliver to me for mixing. However, if you're using some light saturation in your in-the-box mixes and want a little buffer against aliasing, then 96 kHz works great. You may also use plugins that work at 96 kHz internally, and keeping your project sampling rate at 96 keeps them from unnecessarily up and down sampling constantly and with questionable quality. So you see, there are many considerations that have something to do with sampling rate, but none of these really dictate what you have to work at. Instead, most of these are best addressed with their own separate solutions. Personally, I think the biggest possible improvement for the sampling rate subject would be to finally standardize the situation. Imagine everything would already be at the correct same sampling rate. It'd be great. I'm not an expert, but some converter designers seem to think that somewhere between 50 and 70 kHz should be the sweet spot. Whatever the sampling rate would be, I think standardizing it could really free up some headspace of designers, technicians and musicians to worry about more important things. And perhaps we've already been at that point in the past, but then someone came along and said, "Hey look, my sampling rate is bigger than yours." With all this in mind, for the final conclusion, I'd like to share with you what, from my many years of experience as a recordist, mixer, audio enthusiast, mastering engineer and musician, could be formulated as one of the eternal laws of audio. It goes like this. The less apparent the difference that something makes is, the more people will be willing to lose sleep and money over it. That's it for today. Thanks very much for listening. If you have any further questions or your own experiences to share, please do so in the comments. Also, feel free to forward this video to your recording friends. And please make sure to be subscribed here so you'll be notified about future episodes. Thank you very much. Goodbye.